Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Nathan King. He is Professor of Philosophy and Edward B. Lindaman Endowed Chair at Whitworth University. And today we're talking about his book, The Excellent Mind, Intellectual Virtues for Everyday Life. So, Dr. King, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, what is the premise of your book and what motivated you to write it?
Yeah, great. So I think probably the best way to answer that would be to say a little bit about the book's kind of origin story. So I can remember when I was a grad student, just getting ready to go onto the job market, I had to write a statement of teaching philosophy. And I started thinking about, how does this process, if it pans out well, how does it look for the students, right? What are the good results of an education? And so I thought, well, students should graduate with a good deal of knowledge. That seems to be central to education. But knowledge couldn't be enough. So anyone who's taken a final exam knows that, about 2 weeks after the exam, we remember quite a bit less than we learned in studying for the exam. So we forget our knowledge. There's also the notion of connecting some bits of knowledge to other bits, and notice that you could have a lot of knowledge and not have any good idea about how to connect it. And so it seemed like knowledge wouldn't be enough for a complete education. There's also the fact that you could employ knowledge to unwise ends. And so I thought a little bit more, and I thought, well, maybe skills. People seem to be talking a lot about critical thinking skills as a good outcome of a college education. So maybe that's a part of it. And that seems right as well. But we've all known people who employ their intellectual skills to bad ends or maybe selfish ends. So maybe they do it to look smart in front of others, or they do this to kind of get their way in maybe ways that are manipulative. You can imagine a demagogue having some intellectual skills, but putting those skills to sort of bad use. So what's an educational aim that can't be put to bad use? Well, virtues. Virtues can't be put to bad use. And at the time I was writing this purpose statement, I was also reading work in this field in philosophy called virtue epistemology, which is a branch of the theory of knowledge. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. Virtue epistemology is a branch of epistemology that gives the notion of an intellectual virtue a fundamental role. So virtues like curiosity and intellectual carefulness and intellectual humility are the kinds of things that at least some virtue epistemologists would emphasize. And I thought, that kind of gives me the vocabulary and the framework I need for talking about good educational outcomes. Right? I hope that, whatever else they get from my classes, students leave having made progress in virtues like curiosity and open-mindedness, fair-mindedness, and the like of that. So the origin of my thinking about this had to do with writing this purpose statement on the one hand, and then reading works in virtue epistemology by people like Linda Zagzebski and Robert Roberts and Jay Wood and Jason Bear and Heather Baddeley and many others. And there was this sort of happy confluence there. And then as I got a little further along in my career, it became clear that though there were some very good works, that addressed intellectual virtues for students sort of briefly, there wasn't enough out there that was directed primarily towards students. And so I thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity to write something that's pitched primarily toward a student audience or a lay audience, so that everybody can reap the benefits from this excellent work in virtue epistemology that so many scholars were producing.
So let me just ask you, just to clarify this point. So you're focusing on epistemology and more specifically on virtue epistemology, but there's also virtue ethics. So do you think that by focusing on the epistemological side of things, some of these virtues could also manifest, or are you also interested in how they could manifest morally as well?
Yes, I'm interested in both of those topics. And though I think we can make a distinction in theory between intellectual virtues and moral virtues, I think in practice, these sets of virtues overlap in all kinds of interesting ways. So, I mean, if we're going to draw a distinction between intellectual and moral virtues, I think a good way to do it is the way that the philosopher Alan Wilson has done it. And so, if I recall correctly, the distinction goes something like this. Well, intellectual virtues aim distinctively at intellectual ends, like knowledge and truth and understanding. Moral virtues aim at distinctively moral ends. So you might think of, justice or the alleviation of suffering or something like that. And that seems right to me, right? Whatever else they aim at, intellectual virtues must aim at intellectual goods. Whereas it seems like moral goods don't have to aim at intellectual goods. Now, I have to say this is disputed territory. There are some prominent philosophers who refuse to draw a hard distinction between intellectual and moral virtues.
Yeah.
So if you think, as Linda Zagzebski does, that the true is part of the good and that morality is the study of the good, then you'll be less inclined to draw, anything like a hard distinction there. So my position is something like this. If there is a hard distinction to be drawn there, the way to do it is by looking at the different sorts of goods. But in practice, again, I think most virtue theorists agree that these sets of virtues are going to overlap.
Yes, I mean, I think that one obvious virtue that overlaps between epistemology and morality or ethics is courage, right? We have both intellectual courage and moral courage.
Right. Yeah, we can identify clear cases of that, and often in the same person. If we think about a civil rights leader like Martin Luther King Jr., so there you have moral courage as he's willing to face all kinds of harms in fostering a moral cause. But as he does this, he's affirming certain truths and trying to convey certain bits of knowledge in the face of threats as well. Oh. So these dovetail together. Another kind of example that literally comes home to me is the virtue of attentiveness, right? Attentiveness as an intellectual virtue. As I think of those moments when I fail to love my family well, for instance, I think many of those moments are just moments when I'm failing to pay attention. So there's a kind of intellectual error, intellectual fault that's part of the root of my failure to do this moral thing, love my family well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's another great example. But tell us then, what is an excellent mind? Explain perhaps the title of your book. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so there are lots of factors that would go into having an excellent mind. And I don't want to exclude those factors. So I do think knowledge is important. I do think intellectual skill is important. But among the things that I think has to be discussed here are the intellectual virtues. And one way to kind of test to see if intellectual virtues are part of an excellent mind is this sort of linguistic test, right? So think of a sentence like this. Jones has an excellent mind, but is not very careful. Or Jones has an excellent mind, but is arrogant and not humble. Or Jones has an excellent mind, but isn't open-minded. To me, those sentences have a kind of dissonance to them. They're like the intellectual equivalent of a fork in a garbage disposal or something. They make the wrong sounds. And that's at least some evidence that these intellectual virtues are important for having an excellent mind. Maybe another way to see this is to think about people we already see as having excellent minds. Maybe you think of Newton or Galileo or Kepler, or think about the American suffrage movements and the excellence that people like Susan B. Anthony display in giving these arguments for suffrage. As we start to unpack the excellence that those people display, I think we start using virtue language. Oh, right, Galileo was curious, or, Newton, his genius was underwritten by this kind of perseverance in inquiry that few of us ever approach. So I think, another way to think about an excellent mind is to just start with concrete cases and then start to describe them in detail. And I think intellectual virtues kind of fall out of that conversation pretty naturally.
I mean, and I guess that having an excellent mind doesn't entail having a flawless mind, right? Because, I mean, it's inevitable that everyone will make mistakes and errors here and there. I mean, even when thinking about Newton, who is certainly one of the best minds we've ever had in humanity, in our human history. I mean, Einstein ended up improving on his theory of gravity. We now have a better understanding of how gravity works through the work of Einstein than we did through the work of Newton. So, I mean, we all have limitations, and it's just inevitable that even if we have all of these intellectual virtues, we are limited and we will make some mistakes, right?
That seems precisely right to me. Yeah. So one way to see this kind of point is to notice that intellectual virtues can come in degrees. So it's not just, to use the example of a light switch, it's not just as if we have an on-off switch here. Instead, we have like a dimmer switch. It can be on or off, but then once it's on, it can be brighter or dimmer, right? And even our brightest light, right, that we have in our home isn't maximally bright. So I think the intellectual virtues and moral virtues work like that, right? There's a kind of threshold or excellence beyond which we count as having the virtue, and then we can have it to a greater or lesser degree. It's also important to note, I think, so that we don't feel too badly about ourselves, that we can fail to have the virtues, we can fail to have intellectual virtues, and still sometimes act in ways that are characteristic of virtues, right? So we can have at least moments where we think virtuously, right? Where we think courageously, or where we think with perseverance or open-mindedness, even if we don't quite have the virtues. And so as we think of our own aims, and I'm developing this thought from the work of Jason Bear, what we should really be hoping for is meaningful growth, right, toward these virtues. Also important to note that lacking these virtues doesn't entail that we have the corresponding vices, right? So if I fail to be intellectually courageous, that doesn't automatically mean, I'm an intellectual coward. It might mean that I'm somewhere in between virtue and vice.
Right.
So all kinds of layers of complexity here. And, even the most virtuous among us will have room for growth. Even those who are struggling will have moments where we exhibit virtue, at least, temporarily.
Yeah, we're going to explore each of the virtues you talk about in your book and also the corresponding vices. But let me just ask you a couple of questions that whose answer might seem obvious, but perhaps it's not. So why does truth matter? I mean, why should we care about truth?
Yeah, why should we care about truth? Well, the first thing I'll note here is we should ask, is there any really serious argument that we shouldn't care about truth? And one thing that we notice as we think about what an argument would look like, right? Its conclusion is, therefore we shouldn't care about truth. It seems like the person giving that argument would want us to care about at least one truth, namely that we shouldn't care about the truth. And so there's a kind of strange self-defeat going on there. But more positively, I think this is just kind of a human thing, right? We desire what Linda Zagzebski calls cognitive contact with reality. This is a human good that we all find ourselves desiring. Aristotle says all humans by nature desire to know. So, this is one of those things that we could argue about, whether we should care about truth. But we might be in a situation where any premises that we appeal to are already kind of less plausible than what we already know. in our bones, which is that, well, we should care. We should care about the truth. Now, if we have to go and give an argument, I mean, one way to do it would be to imagine someone that's wholly out of contact with reality and ask if they're flourishing. At least for my part, it's hard for me to imagine a person who's wholly out of contact with reality who's flourishing in any sense that we would respect. And if that's the case, it seems to follow that we should care about truth if we care about our flourishing.
And let me also ask you, why do intellectual virtues matter? I mean, what do we need them for exactly?
Yeah, what do we need them for? I love the way you put that, right? If they're important, they're going to be important for something. And I think there are a number of areas we could consider here. So we might consider our personal relationships. And it seems to me that, as I consider interactions with people around me, as I consider my friendships, those are going to go better if I have virtues like humility and curiosity and attentiveness and open-mindedness than if I'm arrogant or if I'm closed-minded to those around me, or if I'm indifferent to what they think, and so on. So these intellectual virtues, in my view, can aid interpersonal relationships. We might also think about civil discourse and the functioning of democracy, and notice that one thing that we need for democracy to function well is the ability to deliberate. Think about all the complex issues about which we have to form policies in order to get by. So think about policies related to climate change or social strife, or we've fairly recently finished a pandemic, right? What do we need to form policies about these things? Well, it seems like we need to be able to deliberate well, and deliberating well seems to require asking the right questions, seeking good answers, thinking for ourselves, right, with autonomy, but not necessarily by ourselves, because we don't have all the information we need as individuals. This has to be a collaborative kind of effort. These issues are complex and very difficult. We can get into falsehood and irrationality very easily. So we'll need to be attuned to our intellectual limitations. So we'll need humility and so on. So I think just as we think about what it takes for a democracy to function, it requires deliberation. And good deliberation, especially consistently across time, seems like it's going to require intellectual virtues. One other area I'll mention, and this is what got me into discussing this set of virtues, is education. Right? So if we think about how education is supposed to pan out, it seems to me that we really want our students to graduate with these intellectual virtues. One way to see this, there's this wonderful line from this American scholar, Judith Shapiro. She says, students, you want the inside of your head to be an interesting place to live the rest of your life. I love that line. You want the inside of your head to be an interesting place to live the rest of your life. And it just seems to me that for a mind to be that kind of place, the mind's going to have to take on a certain character. Right? A mind that is curious and careful and humble and open is going to be more interesting than a place that's closed off and arrogant or indifferent.
So it's certainly not the case that people should assume that intellectual virtues are only good for people who do intellectual work, like academics, philosophers, scientists, and so on. I mean, first of all, it's not even the case that only people who are professional intellectuals can benefit from these virtues, because even if you're just, let's say, someone who likes to learn by themselves, you can benefit from them, but also they can have an important role to play in even your personal life as your life as a citizen, politically and socially. Correct.
I think that's right. Yeah, and maybe one way to see this would be to think of the role of intellectual virtues in a profession that's outside of the academy. So, I grew up in a home where most of my relatives were in trades. So my father made signs for most of his career. My grandfather was a carpenter. My whole family, works on automobiles. And if we think about, all the ways in which being inattentive or being careless in finding an explanation for, why my car isn't working, right?
Yeah.
As we think about these kinds of scenarios, we see the relevance of the intellectual virtues. To my shame, I was doing some rudimentary carpentry, right, trying to carry on the family tradition, and I was inattentive, right? I measured incorrectly, and I cut the wood on the box that I was making incorrectly. There's this saying carpenters have: measure twice, cut once, and I failed to be attentive, and so there was an area where though I'm an academic, my lack of intellectual virtue failed me.
So before we get into each of the virtues, in the book you talk about three features of intellectual virtues, namely the thinking component, the motivational component, and the behavioral component. So tell us about each of them, and why did you come up with these three different components?
Yeah, great. So, I should say in discussing these components, I'm kind of just following tradition in virtue theory more generally, and in the study of intellectual character virtues more specifically. So, I'm following work by people like Linda Zagzebski and Robert Robertson, Jay Wood, Jason Bear, Heather Baddeley, and so on.
Yeah.
So this isn't, unique to me, but people talk about virtues in general and intellectual virtues in particular as having these different components to signal that these are really kind of what we might call multifaceted or multi-track dispositions. An intellectual virtue is not just a way of thinking. It's not just a motivation. It's not just a set of intellectual behaviors. It's dispositions of all those sorts together. So one way to see this is to think of an example. So, you might think of someone who's intellectually honest. Maybe you think of Abraham Lincoln, who's also morally honest, if we want to draw that distinction. So think about the way Lincoln thinks about truth and values it. So he thinks that truth should be respected. He thinks he shouldn't distort the facts of the case. He believes that truth is valuable, right? So that's sort of a bit about the thinking component. Or we could think about the feeling component, or some people talk about just this as a motivational component more broadly. So Lincoln is motivated to get at the truth. He wants it. He wants to avoid falsehood as he seeks to achieve true belief, and then as he seeks to convey the truth to others. And then he disdains lying and liars, right? So there's this kind of motivational / affective component to that virtue of honesty. And then when we think about the behavioral component, he's disposed to tell the truth and not to lie. Right? To have the virtue is to have all of these components together, and not just to have them for a moment, but to have them consistently across time and space and situation.
So let me just ask you, I'm curious about this. I don't know if you ever thought about this specifically or not, but of course, when we're talking about virtues, and that's something that we can go all the way back to Aristotle, I understand them as something that we can develop. We can put effort into developing each of these virtues. But do you think that there are perhaps some people who are just innately more predisposed to showing these virtues than others, and have to put in less effort into developing them?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. At least for certain aspects of these virtues. So there are some people who are maybe genetically, or maybe by way of early childhood development, sort of more disposed to be afraid than others are. or less disposed to be afraid. So, think about those two people, one who's kind of naturally fearful and one who's naturally, without fear or isn't bothered by fear. There's a way in which the person who isn't really bothered by fear won't have to work as hard to develop the virtue of courage. But that's just one component of courage. Notice that even the person who doesn't, find herself afraid a lot will have to develop the kind of thinking or judgment component of courage, right? So someone who isn't naturally afraid could exhibit the vice of rashness pretty easily by making bad judgments about, which things should be feared and at what times and in what ways and to what degrees. So I think you're right that for some people, some of these virtues will tend to be easier to acquire than for others. But all of us will, because these virtues are first of all excellences, and second of all multi-track dispositions. There's probably going to be work for all of us to do.
So let's talk about the virtues themselves then. What is a curiosity?
Yeah. So at least as I think of it, I think of curiosity as the virtue that we need to manage our intellectual appetite well. So each intellectual virtue concerns its own area of activity, or some people put it, I think Jason Bear puts it this way, its own special skill. So what's the area of activity when it comes to curiosity? I think it's managing our intellectual appetite. And so here, notice that just as we can manage our physical appetite well, our appetite for food and drink, we can manage that well or poorly. We can do the same when it comes to our intellectual appetite. So just as we might be insensitive to the kind of food that we need to nourish our bodies, so we could be intellectually indifferent, right? That would be a deficiency with respect to the area of managing our appetite. Or just as we can be gluttonous with respect to food, we could be gluttonous with respect to our intellectual appetite. And so just think of, watching a bunch of social media videos about silly things that don't matter, or, soaking up celebrity gossip or something like that. Those are ways we might, fulfill our intellectual appetite. Are they good ways? Seems like, at least in a lot of cases, maybe they're not. So intellectual curiosity is what we might think of as the mean between those extremes of, on the one hand, indifference, and on the other hand, intellectual gluttony.
Well, let me just tell you that if you are careful enough to properly curate your TikTok feed, you can actually get very good intellectual content there as well.
I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah. So it would be the sort of thoughtless viewing that we would be concerned about. Yeah.
Yeah. And what are the vices, or the vice that corresponds to the virtue of curiosity?
Yeah, so there again, I think the vice of deficiency will be something like indifference, just not caring about knowledge, or not caring about truth. The philosopher Tom Morris gives this wonderful anecdote discussion with a student. So he asks in class, "What's the difference between ignorance and indifference?" And the student, sort of in this chippy voice, says, "I don't know and I don't care." Right? Well, that's exactly right. Right? Ignorance is not knowing. Indifference is not caring. It's the indifference that seems like it's the vice of deficiency here. Right? You don't care enough to nourish your mind well. The opposite vice, the excess, would be a kind of intellectual gluttony, where that might involve consuming intellectual items that are irrelevant to the scope of knowledge in general, or at least to things that are our business. It might involve seeking knowledge of trivialities. You can think of all kinds of cases, but the main point there is we're seeking knowledge thoughtlessly or without regard to what we really should be seeking. Right? So we should be seeking knowledge, at least some of the time, maybe much of the time, about items related to human flourishing, about items that help us gain a broader understanding of the world, and probably at least not so much knowledge of trivialities or things that aren't our business or right. You can fill out the list there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when it comes to the vice of excess, people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche even alerted people that they shouldn't read too much. They should take their time to properly process what they read, and they should be selective in terms of what they read, because I mean, if you just don't put enough time aside to really properly get deeply into what you read, I mean, perhaps you're not gaining much with that, right?
Yeah, that's really great. That reminds me of a Stoic philosopher. I think it might have been Seneca. Recommends that we shouldn't read too broadly. Instead, we might be better served to do something like pick 5 really good books and learn them really well, right?
Yeah. What about the virtue of carefulness? What is carefulness?
Yeah, carefulness. So one way to think of this is if we think of curiosity as the virtue that pulls us toward intellectual goods, carefulness is the virtue that repels intellectual ills. So, falsehood, irrationality, things like that. And so carefulness helps us to avoid thinking, hastily. It helps us to avoid latching onto falsehoods too quickly. It helps us avoid confusion and things like that.
And what are then the vices of excess and of defect of carefulness?
Yeah, so there, I mean, we might think of the deficiency as a kind of carelessness, right? So if we think about reasoning from evidence, a paradigm case of carelessness will be someone who draws a conclusion and is confident in that conclusion, on the basis of a really, narrow, body of evidence or something like that. Someone who jumps to conclusions or is hasty. Right? Those would be, the kinds of cases we have in mind for carelessness. People who are aware of a bunch of cognitive biases, but sort of reason, straight ahead as if those biases didn't exist. Those would be cases of carelessness. And then on the other side, we might think of a kind of, it's hard to think of the right word for this, but maybe scrupulousness. So someone who, maybe a case of this would be someone who is, defending a doctoral thesis or something like this. And the person is so concerned to avoid error that, they double check the dissertation 100 times and are kind of perpetually refusing to turn in the thesis and defend it. That might be a kind of, overly carefulness, right? Scrupulousness, or someone who, I gotta confess, I've done this, rereads an email about an unimportant topic, several times before sending it. That might be, okay, maybe we don't need to be quite that careful.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the deficiency here, you mentioned the biases. It's interesting because back in 2018, I had an interview with Dr. Christopher Chabris, and he's a cognitive psychologist who works on biases. And we talked about what is called the bias blind spot, which interestingly, there are people who just because they memorized the biases that exist, they think that they are then immune to them, but actually they're not. Actually, sometimes they're even they fall even more for those biases just because they think that memorizing them is enough.
That's right, and that's a really nice case where intellectual vices might conspire together, and where we might need intellectual virtues to work together in order to do better. So in that kind of case, the person might be failing to be careful. They might also fail to be humble, right? So if you think of humility as the virtue we need to be aware of and to own our intellectual limitations, it seems like the person who's aware of these biases, but then thinks that they're not prone to them, might be failing to be humble. Likewise, it seems like we need to own our limitations in order to be appropriately careful when it comes to situations where these biases might arise.
So what is then autonomy? What does that mean in this specific context?
Yeah, autonomy. One way I like to talk about autonomy is to think about some prepositions, right? Some prepositional words. So one way I like to put it is autonomy requires that we think for ourselves, but not that we think by ourselves. So think for ourselves in the sense of taking responsibility for our own thinking and our learning, the content of our mind, the development of our mind. But that doesn't mean we should think by ourselves. To think by ourselves would be to allow ourselves, I think, culpably, to be isolated from the knowledge that other people have. So, unless we think that we're sort of smarter than everyone else combined, we should be willing to rely on and even eager to rely on knowledge that other people have. So one way to see autonomy as a virtue between the kind of excessive relying on ourselves that we might characterize as a kind of intellectual isolation, and then the deficiency of not being willing to be responsible for our own thinking. On the one hand, you might think of a student who displays or at least acts in accordance with the deficiency. They come to your office and they're like, just tell me what I need to do to get an A on this assignment, or tell me exactly how I should do this. That seems like the deficiency. We might call that servility or something like that. And then there's, on the other hand, this student who comes into the office and talks to you for an hour and then doesn't heed any of your advice at all. That might be a kind of isolation.
Yeah. Do you think that when it comes to autonomy, we also should be careful, particularly when it comes to an excess of autonomy? And perhaps that would connect with the humility as well. But do you think we should be careful because actually people usually do not think alone and are not good at thinking alone, and we have to be grateful to many other people who produce their work and whose work we consume, because we don't create the entire volume of knowledge that we have, that we consume, and that we then use to produce a little bit more knowledge, right? So we really have to take into account that we are always, to a certain extent, dependent on others for our own thinking and knowledge, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right. And you can find all kinds of really good work in discussions of intellectual virtue about depending on others or being a dependable intellectual agent. You might look at the work of Ryan Byerly on that, being a dependable agent. One way I especially like to illustrate this point that we all rely on others is to think of paradigm cases of intellectual autonomy and see that even there, people are relying to a significant extent on others. So we might think of scientific revolutionaries like Galileo, right? So there's this kind of brave, emblem of Galileo, the autonomous thinker alongside his telescope, right? Yeah. But if you look into the sort of the history of the telescope, what you find is that the telescope, at least conceptually, was invented as a result of two young boys sort of fooling around in a Dutch lens maker's shop, and they put two lenses back together and point them across the street and see that this makes the house across the street look bigger. Okay, that's the conceptual insight that you need for the telescope. And then, of course, people latch on to this and, start making rudimentary telescopes for the summer fairs and so on. These telescopes start selling. And one of them eventually gets back to Galileo. And of course, he has this knowledge of optics that allows him to make a much better version. But I love this case because even autonomous Galileo, right, sitting there with his telescope, relied on insights that other people had.
Yeah, I mean, even looking at Newton's story, I mean, he acknowledged, I think he was the one who used that phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants. So, I mean, even a 190 IQ person was admitting that he relied a lot on the work of other people.
Right? That's right. Yeah, that's a terrific example.
What about humility then? I mean, in what way should we be balanced when it comes to humility, and what are the respective vices?
Yeah. Okay. So when it comes to humility, one way to start is to think about this as the virtue that we need to own our intellectual limitations. Depending on how we divide things up, we might also talk about a corresponding virtue of what we might call self-confidence, which is the virtue that we need to own our intellectual strengths. Mm-hmm. So with respect to humility, there are kind of multiple elements of this. So first, we need to be appropriately aware of our intellectual limitations, right? Mm-hmm. Appropriately concerned with them, and then accurately aware of them, or at least reasonably aware of them. And then we need to own them. So let's walk through these. So there are ways we can go wrong in being overly concerned with our intellectual limitations, or underly concerned, right, with them, right? Not concerned enough. That'd be one fault. So the vices of pride and vanity, right? Those might involve, in various ways, our being overly or underly concerned with our intellectual limitations. Think of the person who's just obsessed with their limitations, right? That's not virtuous. But now suppose we get ourselves to think about our intellectual capacities and strengths, and our weaknesses in this case, to the right extent. Then we're looking at, we want to be accurate when it comes to assessing our intellectual weaknesses, right? We don't want to think we're better than we are, or that we're worse than we are when it comes to intellectual activities. Yeah. And now finally, once we have an accurate or at least reasonable assessment of our intellectual limitations, we need to own them, right? So if I'm just aware that, I tend to be intellectually sloppy, but then I don't do anything about it, I don't count as having the virtue of humility, right? So we have to own those limitations. And we might do that in different ways, right? So sometimes we can do something about our limitations. We can reduce those limitations. Maybe sometimes, if we realize we keep making a certain intellectual mistake, through practice, we can stop making that mistake. In other cases, we can't really fix our tendencies toward mistakes, or at least it's really hard to do that. That might be the case when it comes to certain cognitive biases, right? There, instead of working to change our minds, what we need to do is find a workaround, right? Instead of fixing those limitations, we need to just account for them, even though we can't fix them. So there's a nice case of this, the Princeton philosophy department. Right. Once some of its members became aware of all the cognitive biases that can infect judgments that occur in job interviews. What they decided to do, and instead of engaging in a kind of cognitive bias training so that they could overcome their biases, what they decided to do is work around that limitation by removing the interview from the from the candidating process. They started to just look at the job candidates' files. In other cases, we might not be able to correct our biases or work around them. What we might just have to do is accept that we have them reluctantly. And that goes for other limitations as well, right? Maybe there's just not much that we can do about this. So think about the intrinsic limitations that we might have, right? Not everybody is going to be able to do theoretical physics, right? A person who works as hard as you like to be able to do that just might not be able to do it. That person might have to accept that limitation and then move to another field, right? So maybe a person can't do theoretical physics, but can be a really excellent math teacher, even a college math professor, right? Sometimes we just have to accept our limitations, right? So owning our limitations might concern changing them, right? Or it might concern accounting for them, even if we can't change them. It might concern accepting them. And which one of those is appropriate will depend on what's wise in a given case.
Yeah, you know, humility is a very interesting virtue for me personally, because I mean, you have a particular manifestation of being too humble, where you have, for example, imposter syndrome, where people, it doesn't matter how much you know, how much knowledge you acquire, you're always questioning yourself, and perhaps you get stuck in terms of, oh, I can't do anything because I don't know enough. I can take one step forward because I don't know enough. But then, on the other hand, when it comes to lack of humility, arrogance, I mean, you have philosophers like Nietzsche who in Ecce Homo wrote chapters like why I'm so clever, why I'm so wise, why I write such excellent books. Right. And I laugh a little bit at that because, I mean, he was obviously an extremely intelligent person, but I mean, and perhaps his arrogance to some extent served him well because he was a very bold thinker. But at the same time, I think, okay, perhaps that's a bit too much arrogance there.
Yeah, that's right. And so there are multiple ways to go wrong here. One of them is arrogance. Another is a kind of self-deprecation, which, I wouldn't want to say that everybody who suffers with imposter syndrome has the vice of self-deprecation. There might be lots of factors that go into that, but at any rate, we can recognize that there is a vice that lies in that direction. Yeah.
How about honesty? I mean, and what does honesty mean in the intellectual context?
Yeah, so this is an interesting virtue in at least two ways that I'll mention. The first is that when it comes to honesty, here, like nowhere else, it's less clear to me that there's a clear distinction to be drawn between the intellectual virtue and the moral virtue of honesty. That's because both of these virtues concern how we handle the truth, right? How we handle the facts. The honest person will refrain from distorting the facts or distorting the truth. And here I'm just following the work of Christian Miller. So there's something about the honest person that helps them refrain from distorting the truth, distorting the facts. But of course, the truth is an intellectual good. So there's this intellectual component, but of course, lots of cases of lying are moral failures as well. So that's one interesting feature of honesty, is that it seems to somehow combine both these intellectual and moral elements. Another feature of honesty, and here I'll depart from Aristotle. Aristotle thinks of honesty as a mean between extremes. It's not clear to me that honesty is a mean between extremes. Maybe it is, but it does seem odd to think of the idea of someone distorting the facts or the truth the right amount or to the right degree or in the right way, right? It's not clear to me that there's a mean here, or someone who distorts the truth just enough, right? It seems to me like if we're talking about a capacity for being faithful to the truth, that to depart from that is already to move toward a vice.
I mean, honesty, perhaps in the moral realm, being too honest would be a vice, in the sense that perhaps you do not care at all about how you make other people feel by just being true, by just telling the truth as it is, or at least the way you see it. right?
Yeah, that's a nice point. And maybe what you're pointing to helps us to see a difference between honesty in the moral realm and in the intellectual realm. Maybe there are cases in the moral realm where, being perfectly forthright would be excessive or something like that.
Mhm. Let's talk now about the virtue of perseverance. I mean, I guess that intellectually, this seems a very obvious virtue to have because, of course, particularly people who are academics and even the ones who are not academics who just like to learn by themselves. I mean, of course, people to be a proper intellectual have to put a lot of work and a lot of time into acquiring knowledge, into acquiring proper knowledge, into thinking, into acquiring critical thinking skills and all of that. So it takes a lot of perseverance to become a proper intellectual, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. So, and a good way to see it again is to think about paradigm cases. So think about Newton or Einstein. Think about the intellectual work that the American suffragists did. Think about yourself writing a paper or learning about a discipline in college. These are difficult tasks. These are tasks that present obstacles to our getting knowledge or to our keeping it or to our sharing it with others. Those goods, we require perseverance to push past those obstacles or to encounter those obstacles in the right way. And this holds in intellectual cases. So think about the perseverance it took Newton, to invent the calculus that he needed for his physics, for instance. This also, applies in everyday cases. You think about someone who's, dealing with an automobile that won't start. As you think through that, what's causing that, probably there are multiple possible explanations. You have to work out what's the best explanation of this in order to get at the true explanation and fix your car. There are all kinds of obstacles that might arise in the course of that diagnosis. So precisely because our lives in general and our intellectual lives in particular are just fraught with obstacles to our getting knowledge or our keeping it or sharing it, we need intellectual perseverance.
What about intellectual courage? I mean, what is the proper kind of courage that an intellectual needs?
Yeah, good. So at least as I think of this, courage is a kind of species of perseverance. Maybe not everybody agrees with this, but at least as I think of it, courage, intellectual courage, is the virtue that we need to encounter, those obstacles, so there's perseverance, of the sort that are fearsome or threatening. So think of, someone, say a social justice advocate, speaking the truth in the face of threats. That's a paradigm case of intellectual courage in action, right? So this person is trying to convey intellectual goods of truth and knowledge and understanding, despite the fact that this person is being threatened in various ways. So the area of activity for intellectual courage is persisting in the face of threats or things that are that make us afraid.
I mean, you mentioned an activist. It's interesting. Do you think that perhaps there's another kind of thing that we should consider here that has to do with a conviction? Because of course, to have courage, you have to have a certain level of conviction in your own beliefs, in your own knowledge. But do you think that perhaps there's a case to be made that sometimes you are too convinced of your own knowledge and perhaps that may turn into ideology or something like that?
That's right. So I mean, as Aristotle puts it, we should fear the right things. And in intellectual activities, one of the things we should fear is being misled. right? So to be courageous is not to be without fear. It's not to never encounter threats. It's to, if we think of fear, fear the right things at the right times in the right ways for the right reasons. And so someone could really stick to their guns in defending views that are false and that they should know are false because they haven't been adequately attentive to this danger of, being misled. So that would be to exhibit a kind of rashness, right? To not fear something, in the intellectual realm that this person should fear.
How about open-mindedness and firmness? I mean, particularly when it comes to open-mindedness, what is a proper level of open-mindedness? Because I mean, if your ideas are too fixed, that's bad. But you can also be too open-minded and just accept any kind of idea, even if it's wrong.
Right? That's right. So at least as I'm thinking of this, open-mindedness is the virtue that we need to consider the merits of other views or new views or views that are contrary to ours. Here I'm following people like Jason Bear, among others. Intellectual firmness has to do with sort of maintaining our own beliefs, right? So these virtues pair very nicely together. They probably converge in a lot of real world cases. But take open-mindedness, for instance. That's a kind of willing ability to consider the merits of views that are new or that are contrary to our own. So think about that, considering the merits of those views. So if those views have no merits, or if we have no reason to think they have any merit, then if we're open to them, then we're being excessively open. We're being indiscriminate. So if we take really seriously, there's this conspiracy theory that birds aren't real, right? That would be indiscriminate, right?
Yeah.
But then we can also be closed-minded and fail to take seriously views that really do have some merit, right? And that might be because we're dogmatic. It might be because we're indifferent. But there's that vice of closed-mindedness that's the deficiency here. One thing that we should mention, maybe we haven't mentioned this in enough detail so far, as we seek to find, what we might call the mean between vices, right? As we seek, in this case, to find the mean between the deficiency of closed-mindedness and the excess of kind of indiscriminateness. We're not just seeking a kind of middle ground or Goldilocks zone between too little and too much. A more structured way to think of this is to think of being open to the right kinds of claims at the right times and in the right ways and for the right reasons. So there's a little more structure to this. And in this way, people who talk about intellectual virtues are modeling intellectual virtues on Aristotelian moral virtues, right? So Aristotle says the virtuous act is the one that we do the right thing at the right time in the right way, for the right reason. And so to talk about virtues like open-mindedness, we need to sort of go through each of those items carefully. Maybe we don't have space to do that today. But that gives it a little more structure than this kind of vague, not too much, not too little.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, at least in my understanding, you can be too open-minded, but open-mindedness tends to be a good intellectual trait to have also, because if we consider that knowledge is changing all the time in the sciences, in philosophy and so on, I mean, I think it's generally a good trait to have, to be open to considering new ideas, and considering that perhaps if you insist too much on old knowledge, you're stuck in your ways of thinking, and you have to perhaps update yourself a little bit more. And also, I guess that even when it comes to morality, it's also a good trait to be open-minded, because I mean, for example, when it comes to civil rights and so on, I mean, being able to consider the perspectives of other people that live in ways or think in ways that are different from your own, and still treat them as human beings and think that they should also have their human rights and so on. I mean, at least for me personally, it seems like a proper trait to have. Right.
That seems exactly right to me. I couldn't have put it better.
So, and finally, we have fair-mindedness and charity. So explain those virtues.
Yeah, so fair-mindedness and charity, they in a way piggyback on open-mindedness. So suppose we're open-minded and we decide, okay, I'm going to consider the merits of these new or opposing views. Charity and fairness help us to take the next step and to do that well. So think about a view that opposes, my own view. It might be tempting because it's comfortable for me, to continue to hold my own views. It might be tempting to sort of treat that view or the person who holds that view in ways that I wouldn't treat myself or my own views, right? Mm-hmm. I might set a higher bar of argumentative quality for accepting another person's view than I do my own. Well, of course, that's a lack of fairness. I'm not being even-handed there. So that kind of lack of fairness is a vice. That kind of vice is something we see all over the place in our civic discourse. It's not always very civil, but fair-mindedness is required to treat other views well once we say we're open enough to considering them. There's a handy rule that we might think of here, and this is a rule that we get from morality, and then I'm kind of incorporating or importing to the intellectual realm. So think about what's called the silver rule, right? Don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. If we import this into the intellectual realm, then it's something like, well, in intellectual matters, right? When we're trying to get the truth or keep it or share it, we shouldn't do to other people and their views things that we wouldn't want done to us, right? So set up, a straw man argument or, mischaracterize the other person's view to make it look weaker than it is. We wouldn't want those things done to us, right? And so that's an obvious thing to say, but it's amazing how often we run afoul of that principle. Charity, I think, goes beyond fairness. And so this is another kind of case where going beyond, as in the case of, like honesty, intellectual honesty anyway, needn't be a vice. So we could go beyond fairness if we not just characterize the other person's view or argument accurately, but if we cast it in its best reasonable light, right? If we are willing to sort of steel man, this is the common term, steel man the other person's argument, make it the best it can be, right? And that's a very important kind of thing to do in inquiry, because that allows us to see not just the views that are out there, but the best views and the best arguments that there could be. That, I think, brings us closer to the truth. And it's also a way to show respect and even love for other inquirers, right? And so going beyond fairness can really be a good thing.
Okay, so just one final question, and this, I guess it would be sort of a final message from you. So, and this is going back to the point we touched on earlier about how intellectual virtues apply not only to the intellectual life of people, but also their personal life and their political life, their social life, and so on. I mean, because someone, even after listening to this entire interview, should still say, oh, okay, but I'm not an intellectual. I don't really care that much about intellectual virtues and so on. Why should I read Dr. King's book? I mean, what would you say to them?
Yeah, well, I mean, without plugging the book too much, let me just plug the virtues that the book talks about. I mean, one way to think of this is in terms of a dinner table conversation. So, tomorrow in America, we're celebrating Thanksgiving. And, there's this common occurrence at American Thanksgiving dinner tables where someone, usually it's somebody's uncle, starts talking about politics and carries on in a way that's really not winsome, right? That's unfair to other views, or uncharitable, or that's arrogant or something like that. And so one thing I would say is that these intellectual virtues, right, if more of us seek them, are the kinds of things that will make us have better conversations over Thanksgiving dinner. And who could be against that?
Okay, so let's see if someone in Thanksgiving applies or tries to apply some of these virtues when discussing with their uncle and other people in their family.
Let's hope for that. It'll be all I can do to make sure that I'm not committing acts of intellectual vice around the table myself. So I think we all have to start with ourselves rather than starting with other folks.
Great. So the book is, again, The Excellent Mind, Intellectual Virtues for Everyday Life. I'm, of course, leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. King, are there any places on the internet where people can find you and your work?
So I have a website that's just Nathan, I think it's nathan-king.org. But if you just look up Nathan L. King Philosophy, you'll probably find it. The Excellent Mind is available on the Oxford University Press website. I'll be able to send a link to that site shortly, and it's available at other online booksellers as well.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a very fun conversation.
Thanks again for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.